Hi guys, welcome to my next class about mistakes in Egyptian hip technique. So please pay attention, study, and don't make these mistakes in your hip movements. Let's continue and we will take the next hip movement, and it's going to be hip accent out with traveling. Guys, so the first mistake in this movement is when people are trying to work from the waist or from the chest instead of working from the down of your belly. The next mistake is when people fall down too much on their foot in the back. The next mistake is when people are not trying to move their hips from the down of their belly and not feeling their hip bones and hips inside, and they are trying to do this movement with straight legs. The next mistake is when people don't feel their hip bones inside and they are not working clear with their hips and making soft and unclear movement instead. The next mistake is when people are lifting their front foot too much and they are making their knee up. Guys, let's continue, let's go on, and the next movement is going to be twist with traveling, and please pay attention to the first mistake. It's when people are trying to do this twist with straight legs. The next mistake is going to be when people are trying to work with both of their hips instead of moving only one hip in the twist. The next mistake is when people are not doing this movement stable and they are falling too much down on their foot. The next very important mistake is when people don't feel their joints separately and they are trying to move with both their hips. They are not contracting their muscle, so that's why their movement looks unclear, and they are not pushing only one knee to make the clear hip movement. Let's continue and let's go on to the next movement, which I call a difficult hip drop. The first mistake is going to be when people are trying to make this movement again with straight legs. Guys, ladies, the next mistake is when people confuse this hip drop with Suherzaki movement. We go on, and the next mistake is when people are not feeling their muscle and they are not contracting their muscle in the hip. That's why their movement looks very soft and unclear. The next mistake is going to be when people are trying to push their opposite hip up, instead just working with their right hip down. The next mistake is when people are confusing this hip drop down with the twist. The next mistake is when people start to jump with their head down instead of making this movement clear with their head stable. We proceed, and the next movement which we are going to study is hip down down with accent. The first mistake is going to be when people are trying to help to do this movement with their upper body. The next mistake is when people are trying to do this movement again with straight legs. The next mistake is going to be when people are not feeling their hips inside, their hip bones inside, and they are not moving with their knees one by one, and also they are not contracting their muscles, and that's why their movement looks very soft and unclear. The next movement which we are going to study is the hip drop. The first mistake is when people are trying to do hip drop with straight legs. The next mistake is when people are trying to sit down too much and their head starts to jump up and down. The next mistake is when people are moving their hip too much to the side. The next very important mistake is when people are not working with this knee back. That's why their hip movement is not complete and it's not clear. The next mistake is when people are not contracting their muscle here, so that's why their movement looks not complete. The next movement is our hip up with step. And the first mistake is when people are trying to do this movement with straight legs. The next mistake, and it's super important one, is when people don't divide their body into two parts and they don't work just with one joint in this movement, but they are trying to move both their hips and they are not working just with one knee in the side. And the last mistake in this movement is when people are not contracting their muscle in their hip from one side and another side. So that's why their movement looks unclear and not complete. Guys, so we continue, and the next movement which I'm going to talk about is choo-choo shimmy. So the first mistake in this movement is going to be when people are not feeling their hips and they are not putting the power of this movement into their hips, but they mostly work with their legs and knees. The next mistake is when people are trying to do their choo-choo shimmy with putting their hips too much in the back and they open their legs too much. The next mistake is when people are trying to do choo-choo shimmy with their hips not just up and down, but they are moving them to the sides. Let's go on and we continue with the next movement, which I call the hip accent in the back with traveling. The first very rude mistake is when people are trying to do this movement with their straight legs. The next very important mistake is when people are not feeling their joints, their hip bones separately, and they are trying to move with both of their hips in the back. And also they don't help with their knee moving in the back to move and make their clear hip accent. And the last mistake which I'm going to tell you is when people don't contract their muscle in the hip to make a clear hip movement. My dears, we continue and we go on to the next hip movement, and it's going to be camel with traveling. And the first mistake is when people are trying to do this movement with straight legs and they are not helping with their knees to push their hips. The next very important mistake in this movement is when people are trying to do camel not from the down of their belly, but they are trying to work from the waist. The next mistake is when people contract their hips too much, so their hips are not free, and that's why they don't move forward and back. And the last mistake in this hip movement is when people are trying to fall down too much on their supporting leg, and that's why their head starts to jump up and down. My dears, thank you so much for watching, and this class was one of my lessons about mistakes in Egyptian hip technique. And if you want to check yourself if you are doing the other movements correctly or not, you can go and watch my previous classes about mistakes in Egyptian hip technique. See you there!